Boardroom Bound, Episode 89, Using Your Board Role to Empower Those Around You, with Esther Aguilera.
Clearly, women have been pioneers and on so many fronts, and in this front as well. And really, the genesis of much of that, a lot of women's groups or even Latino African-American groups have been pushing for equity in the boardroom, but none of those external efforts really were taken seriously until you had the institutional investors and shareholders who got involved.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're speaking with Esther Aguilera. She is the president and CEO of the Latin Corporate Directors Association. And LCDA is doing some amazing stuff, not only solidifying the current generation of fantastic Latino directors we're seeing in the boardroom, but preparing the next generation. And what we'll talk about today are some of the trends that we're seeing for diversity in the boardroom, and certainly how important that is, but also the wonderful work that they are doing in their training, their development, their advocacy. For example, their Boardroom Ready Institute, fabulous. They worked with the leading corporate governance experts to build this. Very excited to hear what they are doing today and the direct impact that it's happening. Let's jump into this episode. Esther Aguilera, welcome to the Boardroom Bound Podcast.
Pleasure to be with you, Alexander. Thank you for having me.
Well, this is great because, it's always a good time to talk about diversity in a boardroom, but specifically there are some fun things, fascinating things, fast-moving things going on that make this even more timely. Clearly, we are approaching Hispanic Heritage Month, which is a great time to celebrate the wonderful contributions that we're seeing by some of your amazing members in the boardroom, and we know future board members will bring those as well, but clearly something that's going on right now with SB 979. But before I get excited and we dive into some of that fun governance stuff, I'd like our audience to understand your background. So you've been leading LCDA for about 5 years now, but before that you had an incredible career back on the Hill and we're doing wonderful things, certainly raising the profile of the Hispanic group as well. So why don't we start there and you can help set the scene for us.
Happy to. So I have been privileged to work with some of our most accomplished leaders in every sector. I moved to Washington, D.C. in 1990 and moved here from California. Didn't plan on it, but I worked with members of Congress as the executive director of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I've worked with cabinet members in the executive branch. I've worked for some of our leading not-for-profit leaders. So I've been involved in advancing Latinos in the most important positions of power. And so it was very fitting that I joined the Latino Corporate Directors Association. Again, it was over 4 years, not quite 5, but, and that's sort of been my brand, to leverage the power and strength of the few that we do have in positions of power to really open up doors and bring the contributions and the voices of Latinos at the decision-making table.
And just to give our audience a sense of what we're talking about with LCDA, I mean, my simplistic way of describing it, and tell me if I get this right, is, you have U.S. Latinos that serve on publicly traded as well as large private companies, aspiring C-level directors. And the goal is really to make sure not only that you're using the wonderful and accomplished people that you have today that are sitting on the boards. I know something in the order of about a third of the board seats held by Latinos in the Fortune 1000 are members of LCDA. So it tells you the scope and the breadth that you have. And you're talking leading corporations, Target, HP, Ford, Honeywell, CBS, the names that we would all recognize. And you are doing that to increase the number of U.S. Latinos on corporate boards today and for the future. It seems like such a tall order, but I imagine in the 4.5-ish years, you've probably seen a lot of momentum come behind this, right? Does that feel fair?
There is, it was the right timing to get this started. We got it, the organization got started and we've been in full operations again since I joined. I put together our strategic framework to advance our mission. And, unbeknownst to us, there's clearly been a need and momentum in this space. But you described the Latino Corporate Directors Association perfectly well. This is a community of U.S. Latinos at the highest levels of corporate leadership that are committed to paying it forward. And our mission is to develop, support, and increase the number of Latinos on board. And we have a three-part strategy. It's a very comprehensive strategy to do that. But I will say that this is certainly long overdue. It's the first time in our community that we're bringing together Latinos, at the highest levels of corporate leadership and, galvanizing this powerful group of very incredible members. I always say that our membership includes some of the most accomplished and respected leaders in business, not only nationwide, but globally. And as you mentioned, a very, very impressive group of individuals. And a main part of the reason that this group was sorely needed was twofold. One is our numbers on board does not reflect the talent pool. Our numbers we have less than 3% of Latinos that hold Fortune 1000 board seats, company board seats. And so part of what we kept hearing was, there's always this excuse, well, we can't find Latinos with this skill set or that skill set. And so we wanted to take away the excuse that you cannot find qualified Latinos for the boardroom.
It sounds like the reasoning that we would often hear in the past for why women weren't on the boardroom, right?
Well, correct. And even more so, I think Latinos have been the group, and I'll kind of share with you some of the statistics that have been the least represented compared to our size in the population than any other group. And so, people don't know that. And then until we have, this effort that not only was organized by directors and led by directors, but also shedding light on not only where we stand, but what companies have to gain by having Latino and Latino voices in the boardroom. So we wanted to take away the excuse, and we wanted to be part of the solution, because at the same time, what I always say is that you can point fingers and complain about an issue. The question becomes, also, what are we doing about it? And so we wanted to be solutions oriented in how we approach this.
And
I will say, Alexander, just as a backdrop for your audience who may or may not know, when I mention our numbers are really low, I think it's important to point out just the size and economic powerhouse that this community represents. So we are 60 million Americans in the U.S. of Latino descent and identify as U.S. Latinos. This is 1 in 5, it's nearly 20% of the population, nearly 1 in 5 Americans. We have a GDP that totals over $2.1 trillion. It is, it's a community, obviously we're not all Spanish speakers, but we have this cultural affinity and background. But our numbers are larger than Spain and every Latin American country except for Mexico. Of course, we're we identify as, for example, myself as American, as Latina. Latino or Hispanic are interchangeable, by the way. And my roots are Mexican. I was born in Mexico. So it's a country like the U.S. where you can really celebrate and embrace, your various identities and have those, contribute in the U.S. So in terms of our, purchasing power and the GDP of 2.1 trillion, it is roughly not only about the size of India in terms of a marketplace. I mean, this is a huge marketplace here in the U.S. I mean, it's larger. If it were, just a separate entity, it would be the 7th largest economy in the world. It is just, and it's here in the U.S. and contributing, obviously, big contribution to everything that is part of the U.S. And with that, I'm going into a few different tangents here, but I think it's critical, one, to understand that, Latinos have been, part of the U.S. even since, before the U.S. existed. In the 1700s, we had the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically the U.S. gained the states of, California, Arizona, Colorado, you name it, Texas, became part of the U.S. And so you had the residents of those states then become citizens. And so you have, again, a very rich history, not just in those southwestern states, but New York and Florida, et cetera. So I think it's important that people kind of know, we've been fighting in civil wars. I mean, since the Civil War and contributing, lives and blood, sweat, and tears here to building the U.S. and making contributions in every area, and often it's not, recognized. So I think, especially as we're approaching Hispanic Heritage Month, Latinos aren't always top of mind, or the media has portrayed us more as, we're immigrants. Anytime Latinos come up, it's in the context of immigration. And so I think that's another reason why our organization is so important, because we want to show the face of very accomplished business leaders and corporate directors. Look, they're in the boardroom because we have Latino CEOs and, who've run, and others who've run large, P&Ls. They're in the boardroom because they bring that business acumen and their experience, and, they are Latino and bring an added lens into the huge Latino marketplace, which especially, I think for every company it's important. We are driving consumption growth in all mass consumer products year over year. Walmart will say that year over year in the U.S., the U.S. market, Latinos represent 90% of the year-over-year growth. Car purchasing, home buying. This is a tremendous, you don't have to go outside of the U.S. to find this very robust marketplace here. And that voice, obviously, our members bring their deep business experience and this additional lens. So that's kind of, there's many business reasons for it, but clearly the advantage to any company is huge. So wanted to kind of throw that in.
So Esther, when I think about those and I step back and I bring it to a strategic level, I imagine the opportunity for you guys, and I'd love to tackle both of these one in turn, is probably growing the supply and growing the demand. And I'm just a simple business guy. When you think about the supply, identifying, preparing, and growing the pool of Latino qualified board directors. And we can talk about that because you guys have your Board Ready Institute. And then after we talk about that, then I'd love to think about the growing the demand part, right? It's increasing opportunities for a greater number of talented Latinos to be on corporate boards. And I think both of those are going to be so helpful, not only to hear the great work that you guys are doing. I know BRI is incredible. The groups you worked with to put this together is a phenomenal platform that you guys have built. I know that will be instrumental for all of our audience listening because they can pick up so much from it. So let's give credit where credit is due. Your Board Ready Institute, you built this with many of the leading thinking board groups in the world. So I'd love to talk about this more in depth. And I know your curriculum is really in three parts as best I understand it. You have the learning and preparation, you've got the board level networking and mentoring, and the exposure and the marketing. So maybe you can talk us through what it would look and feel like if, say, one of our listeners were to apply and say, "Oh, I'm a CEO and I'm could be a qualified member, and I'd love to be involved." Can you give us a sense of what it would look like to go through that curriculum?
Absolutely, and thank you, Alexander. Again, I think you summarized. So when I joined a little over 4 years ago, I put together our strategic framework that precisely to invite everyone to go to our website, LatinoCorporateDirectors.org, and on the front page, we list our strategy to accelerate Latino placements on boards is focused on three areas. To mention one, growing the supply. We cannot, and I'll come back to our Board Ready Institute, but we can't increase our numbers on board, with the same individuals obviously having more seats. It's about growing the pool. And so we focus in a very deep way on the supply. We focus to our three-pronged strategy: grow supply, grow demand, which is extremely a busy time for right now. And our third is raising awareness. And we've built some tremendous research capabilities that actually support some of our demand work. So it's, kind of makes sense, but there's a deep dive in each one of these. On growing supply, we, early on, part of our mission has been to build the bench of the next directors. And to do that, requires kind of a comprehensive approach, kind of a wraparound approach to supporting our executives. So first we're surfacing and identifying Latinos, and we have a robust sort of list of criteria of what we look for, because our executives, we vet them based on, obviously these are C-level Latino executives, some with large P&L experience, really the type of deep and global and large expertise that boards look for. So starting with, the identifying and reaching out, or individuals are welcome to go to our website and let us know through the website that you're interested. It starts there. The program, the Board Ready Institute, we have some of the professors that are involved through the Stanford Rock Center on Corporate Governance and KPMG and others. We work with NACD and board lists on some of the curriculum. So we have the learning and preparation work. We have first a toolkit. The toolkit helps individuals on their journey to the boardroom with some of the basics around, putting together your bio. And we have, writers that will help support with that. Pitching your bio and leveraging your network. I think how to do that and growing your network, obviously. But first, we always say that, 98% of the time you're going to get on your first board from those who know you. So you want, and, your board profile needs is very different than your executive profile. So that's kind of the toolkit to kind of start your pathway to the boardroom. And then second involves, key governance issues. We put together both in-person and virtual, but of course this year everything is virtual.
Right.
Sessions. We do mock boardrooms where we take case studies and put our executives in a boardroom based on a particular case and challenge them how they would respond to a scenario. I mean, there's what Alexander, what you and I both know is that today there's the roles of directors are very stretched. Companies are, there's a lot of more risk and disruption. I mean, innovation is good, but you also need to consider how it is both an asset but also a risk with potential other companies that could be in your marketplace, new markets, or through cybersecurity, et cetera. So just the environment we're in, and the rapid pace of things means that, directors have a lot of demands on their time. So we take some of those case studies and expose our executives. Well, besides kind of positioning and prepping you for the boardroom, we want to make sure that when you walk into that boardroom, you are, well prepared to contribute on day one. That's one of the goals of the learning and preparation. And it's also very hands-on, because we'll have more mock interviews. So we work with a lot of our search firm partners from Korn Ferry, Russell Reynolds, Heidrick and Struggles, and Diversified Search, and Egon Vendor and others. They will have some of their search executives who will do one-on-one mock interviews. So you practice your pitch and you practice, what you've put down. And it's very helpful, before you get into an interview to get that. And we set up the executives with coaches depending on certain needs. If you have an interview, we can help prep for that. And let's say you've had some of our members get the board seat, then we also have members that will coach on here's what to expect and how to prepare for your first board meeting. I mean, it's a very hands-on, it's not just theoretical, it's very comprehensive. And I would say that the third part is the positioning and profiling our executives for the boardroom. So we want to get their names and announce who, we call it our feature on Primed for the boardroom, because it's important that, what our search firm partners tell us is when these executives get LCDA's stamp of approval, then clearly it's on their radar screen. So you are getting the exposure, building your network, not only with other directors, but those who influence board placement. And you've got, the learning, and it's that comprehensive approach, plus raising the profile. I would say last is one of the general things that we do, and this is on our demand side, but we do help and work with search firms and companies who are looking for diverse directors. So, for example, last year we had 70 companies and search opportunities that we helped kind of identify a pool of qualified Latinos for that board opportunity. We will get the profiles of our executive members and our aspiring directors out there for these board opportunities. So it's, again, just really comprehensive effort. We think, everything we do has to kind of be a deep dive, because that's really what it takes. It's a slow-moving area. So I hope that gives Alexander happy to dive deeper on any one of those areas.
Well, Esther, I'd love if we could set the scene at a 30,000-foot view level, because I think when we talk diversity in a boardroom, people can imagine different things. It's very easy to go to gender. And as someone who helps lead 2021 on Board's efforts, it's very easy to set the scene that, we want to get to that point. I think the new goal since it's 2020, they've already met the 20%, maybe it's 2050, and they want 50% to have an equity split, right? It's easy to picture that. And I know a partner at Heidrick & Struckle said, we won't take a board search unless we guarantee that at least half the slate can be female candidates. And you talked about the organization you're working with before. You were talking about the Black Directors Association, there's LCDA, there's the Asian, et cetera. There's a lot more than just male-female dynamics. And how do we get to the point where it becomes normal that we're thinking about how do we put a whole diverse slate together from all these different perspectives? I don't know that we're there yet, and I'm sure you've got a much better finger and a pulse than I do about that.
Well, I think when clearly women have been pioneers and on so many fronts and in this front as well. And really the genesis of much of that, a lot of women's groups or even Latino African-American groups have been pushing for equity in the boardroom, but none of those external efforts really were taken seriously until you had the institutional investors and shareholders who got involved. Mm-hmm. And, it started with pushing for more gender equity. Because aside from the fact that, you have boards that are all male or all white male, in this day and age, it's, time for that change. But the institutional investors have, fiduciary duty to, when they advance something, it is advancing it because it is good for the shareholders' investment. So, clearly there has been a lot of research and the case studies are out that more diverse voices in the boardroom and the work of McKinsey and others clearly show that diverse teams, both gender and race ethnicity, reach better results, or those companies are performing better than their peers that are not as diverse. And so I think all of the research and learning, the investors were able to take that information and say, look, this is about our investment and shareholder returns. So, as we know, the board is accountable to the shareholders. So once the shareholders and investors galvanized, and especially in the last 5 years and the last 3 years, we've been seeing some results on the demand side of what we do, which we'll get to after this. It has been the investors that have helped create a lot of the demand. So I work with a lot of the investors and have been involved. For example, there is the 30% coalition. Mm-hmm. Which is not the 30% club, but it's the 30% coalition. I'm on the board. It's an organization that started, a lot of bringing together institutional investors, and it includes 13 state treasurers and some of the city treasurers, some of the large pension funds who kind of coalesced. And what they do is, they will adopt a company, and multiple investors will write to a company saying, well, I started again with gender, and this was, how a big push resulted to get more women on the board. And now the investors and shareholders are, also in the last few months calling for more transparency, disclosure, and more inclusion of race ethnicity on boards. And so I think what companies and CEOs and boards should expect is actually an increasing voices from investors, from the community, from leaders, and other stakeholders for more equity. So that is now really taking hold. And then, of course, when you have other players like Institutional Shareholder Services, or it's called ISS, which obviously make proxy recommendations, they, were making proxy recommendations when company boards did not have women. Of course, now, they're taking a look at the broader sort of diversity issues. So there's a lot at play here, and how it push really got its momentum, again, through the shareholders and investors, and then how it's shaping now and where it's going is a very timely conversation. Well, happy to go into that even further.
Well, I was going to say, speaking of that, and the time flies, so we'll have to cover more of this in another episode, but I don't want to forget the great progress that we're seeing today, and a great way to wrap up today's episode will be talking about what we're seeing happen in California. I know you've been very involved with the SB 979, and if some of our audience may not be as familiar with it yet, if you could share the great work that you're seeing and the progress that's happening and what we hope will come as a result of this.
Yes, well, California issued the first gender mandate bill, which has been another big push on the demand side. It was SB 826 that would require California-based public companies to have women on the boards, and the numbers go up as the years come. And then just, last month, the California Assembly and the Senate passed kind of a companion bill. It's structured in the same way as the gender bill, that would require race and ethnicity and more diversity on boards. And basically what happened is Senator Holden and several other Latino legislators were looking at this issue, and around the same time, LCDA, we put some research out because, look, what we found is, a focus on gender is great, but if we're going to have gender representation that's inclusive of women of color, it needs to be more intentional. Basically, our research found that of the women appointed to California-based company boards between the time the law was enacted and a year later, of the 511 appointments, 78% were white women, 11% were Asian, 6% African American, and only 3.3% Latina, in a state where we're nearly 40% of the population. And so the legislators said, well, this picture, doesn't reflect the strength and diversity of California, and it's unacceptable that California leads on diversity, and we still have all white boards. So our data also showed that there was significant and needed increase in gender representation, but that still left a third of the companies still remain all white. Plus, we did a deeper dive and looked at all public companies in California, and a very shockingly low number, only 17% of California-based company boards have a single Latino or Latina on their board. This is California. So I think that
so big opportunity for growth.
The timing for our data came at a good time. Again, we didn't plan it that way, but clearly the authors, they just, again, a few weeks ago on a Saturday passed it, and they changed the language to include the research in our data because no one else was disclosing this, which, Alexander, I know we have a lot more to talk about because we have a lot of work we're doing on, some of the policy and governance issues around disclosure, and on the demand side, there's a lot going on, but I'm so happy that you gave me the opportunity to share what we're doing, what we're about with your audience.
Well, Esther, I'm delighted to share that recent success. That's great news. I find it very difficult to imagine how to innovate in a boardroom if we don't have diversity of thought. So I think this is a good goal for all of us to be pushing for, whether we are in the boardroom, want to be in the boardroom, or just employees or shareholders, whatever you might be. So I think this is good for society, and kudos to you guys for the great work that you were doing. And of course, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Happy to do it. Look forward to the next one. Thank you, Alexander.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Esther Aguilera. It's fantastic to hear the success that we're seeing for the Latino corporate directors, because we know that we need diversity in the boardroom, not just male and female. And it was really interesting, the statistics she was talking about, say, California-based organizations and how few Latino directors they have in the room, despite the preponderance in the population. And we know there are great directors in all sorts of different categories of diversity. So I enjoyed hearing not only about their success, but the great training that they're doing, preparing the next generation. And of course, all the stuff they talk about in their training is applicable for all of us, no matter who we are, what we look like, where we are in our journey along the way. Now, please, if you remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to everything we talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we'll bring you to every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.